So huge thanks to our speaker, Sylvie Broussine, today for her talk on Rossetti's Portraits, an exhibition that was at the Holburne Museum. Sylvie is the Assistant Curator at the Holburne Museum. She was a former Art Fund Curatorial Trainee at the National Gallery, where she specialised in 17th century Spanish painting. At the Holburne, she curated Rossetti's portraits and has contributed to other exhibitions such as Grayson Perry, The Pre-Therapy Years, and Édouard Vuillard, The Poetry of the Everyday, and Thomas Lawrence, Coming of Age. So it's our pleasure to welcome Sylvie today to tell us about Rossetti's portraits. Thank you, Sylvie, over to you.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to start by saying thank you. Well, thank you to Sarah for inviting me to speak today, and thank you to everyone for coming today and hearing me talk about Rossetti's portraits. I wanted to start by saying that so today is the 160th anniversary of the death of Elizabeth Siddal. She died on the 11th of February 1862. Elizabeth, or Lizzie as she was known by her circle and by Rossetti, is one of the key protagonists of this talk. So I felt like it was nice to acknowledge this anniversary. So today, as Sarah has said, I'm going to be talking about the genre of portraiture in Rossetti's body of work. And this is a big subject. It's a much larger topic than I had initially anticipated when I first started working, when I first started researching the exhibition Rossetti's Portraits, which was on at the Holburne Museum over this past autumn. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to move my slides. Here we go. Okay, so I'm just starting with a couple of the installation shots of the exhibition. For anyone who wasn't able to come to Bath and see the show, this is just to give you a sense of what the exhibition looked like. So when I first started working on a Rossetti show, I had a relatively small selection of works in mind that would form the kind of core narrative of the exhibition. And at the very early stages, not many of them were portraits in the kind of conventional sense of conventional way of the genre. Instead, what I'd originally wanted to focus on were works that kind of blurred the boundaries between portraiture and other genres, so particularly narrative and abstract compositions. One of the things that fascinated and still fascinates me now about Rossetti is, Rossetti in particular, is that he's an artist whose body of work has very much been interpreted and understood through the sort of intertwinement of art and life. So through works that depict kind of biblical or literary or symbolic or abstract subjects, but are kind of understood now through a biographical lens and through the lives and identities of the models that are represented in his works. So this biographical aspect has become fundamental to how we as modern day viewers now understand Rossetti's art. And it's through this interpretation of many of his paintings can be understood through the genre of portraiture. And this is something that I'm going to be talking about a bit later on with a few specific examples. But I wanted to start the discussion by talking about Rossetti's more conventional portraits. And I use conventional for kind of want of a better word here. But what I mean by that, by conventional portraits, are works which depict individuals or an individual whose identities are the primary subject of the work. I came to realize quite quickly through my research for the exhibition just how prolific Rossetti was as a portraitist. He produced portraits of at least 90 different sitters and worked in the genre from the very kind of early stages of his career right up until his death in 1882. He did accept some portrait commissions. That wasn't very frequent. And I wouldn't really consider him as a kind of a formal professional portraitist, but instead I would characterize his work in this genre as personal and intimate, informal. These are works made as gestures of respect and friendship and affection. And indeed, by far, the vast majority of Rossetti's portraits were of those closest to him. So family, friends, fellow artists, and the three women who were so key in his life, Elizabeth Siddal, Fanny Cornforth, and Jane Morris, each of whom I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later on. He worked mostly in the kind of more immediate and the more informal mediums of pencil, ink, pen, and later on in his career in chalk. These were materials that he could use sort of very informally in kind of social settings and in intimate settings, as opposed to the kind of more laborious and more formal medium of oil paint. So a lovely example which encapsulates for me this kind of informality and intimacy is this self-portrait of Rossetti sitting to the artist Elizabeth Siddal. So this is Rossetti drawing himself being in turn drawn by Siddal, who by this point in 1853 had become his companion as well as his pupil and model. The whole feel of the work is quite casual and intimate. And there's this sort of wonderful energetic line that reads through this work. And to me, it reads as sort of, he's sort of quickly trying to capture a moment that's happened earlier on in the evening or earlier on in the day. I'm opening this talk with a self-portrait, and the Holburne exhibition also opened with a self-portrait. It opened with this work on the right hand side, which is dated to 1855. Self-portraiture was not a common subject for Rossetti. There are only 6 that we know of in existence today that we know of. All of these were made in either pencil or ink. He never painted himself in oil. This work on the right-hand side, this was done when he was 27, and it was later used as the frontispiece by his brother, William Michael. It was used for the frontispiece for a publication of letters and memoir that William Michael Rossetti did. It's also a work that's connected to one of the more infamous chapters of Rossetti's life. Rossetti gave this self-portrait to his agent, Charles Augustus Howell, in 1869, following the exhumation, or following Charles Augustus Howell's help in the exhumation of Siddal's coffin, her body, to retrieve a manuscript of poems that Rossetti had buried with her and that he later wanted to publish. The work on the left is the earliest of his self-portraits. This was done in 1847 when he was 18 and a student at the Royal Academy. This really shows him experimenting with self-imaging within the Romantic tradition. And you can see here, he's got this sort of curling, flowing hair and this kind of penetrating gaze, which sort of shows his concentration as he's studying his own face. Because it's a self-portrait, it's the first of his portraits to forego the kind of full profile portrait, and I've got a couple of earlier examples of those in a moment. And I think without that sort of profile, the side view, I think this work really kind of brings out a whole kind of energy to it. And I mean, he looks incredible. He's taking himself incredibly seriously, I think, in this work. He presents himself as a fashionable portraitist of the day here. And as you can see, there's kind of very little visual reference to medievalism or the kind of graphic style that Pre-Raphaelites and Rossetti became known for just 2 years later. So around the same time, or just slightly earlier than that self-portrait, he produced portraits of his siblings. His siblings were his first subjects, really. So the work on the left was done in 1846. This is William Michael, his younger brother, who's aged 17 here. And on the right-hand side, we've got Christina Rossetti, who is aged 16 here. These seem to be, well, these are part of a group of very much the earliest portraits that Rossetti did. The earliest ones that we know of are from 1846. So we know of at least 2 other portrait drawings of his younger brother, William Michael, and 4 other images of Christina from this period, including, interestingly, one oil portrait that was done in 1848. These are profile portraits, and I read these as this is very much Rossetti teaching himself the genre. To me, I mean, they're sort of quite a formal distancing kind of effect, but he's clearly taken a lot of care and detail, particularly I think with Christina and the way in which he's executed her hair there. Following the images that Rossetti made of his close family, the next kind of significant group of people that he made portraits of were fellow artists, most notably members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So discontent with the formal education on offer at the Royal Academy, the practice of drawing each other's likenesses was an important form of artistic training within the Pre-Raphaelite circle. And friends and family were, of course, they were the most kind of available, cheapest models, and they did model for each other in their paintings. But what I wanted to focus on here is what we've kind of phrased as, or what we've called friendship portraits. That were made kind of in the early 1850s between members of the Brotherhood. So as well as being a form of artistic training, portrait making was very much a form of social bonding between artists. And these drawings were created as gestures of mutual affection and exchanged or gifted to each other, which is what we find with these three works on the screen now. So on the left is a small drawing from the National Portrait Gallery of the Pre-Raphaelite sculptor Thomas Woolner. So he, having failed to receive commissions in the UK, he emigrated to Australia in July 1852 to try his luck in the goldfields. And this portrait was done just a couple of weeks before his move to Australia. And I think there's a slight kind of apprehension in his face and a slight distancing in his face. He doesn't meet our gaze. And I read this as him instead he's sort of looking out towards the kind of the unknown future, his future out in Australia. Woolner described this work himself as a careful likeness, which is a very kind of safe way of describing a portrait. And it was given to a mutual friend of theirs, a mutual friend of Woolner and Rossetti's, Mrs. Eliza Orme, and it was given to kind of commemorate his departure. 10 months later, on the 12th of April, 1853, at the suggestion of Rossetti, the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites met for breakfast at Millet's house, and they drew each other's portraits to send out as gifts to Thomas Woolner in Australia. So here in the centre, we have William Michael, who we've seen from 7 years earlier. And on the right-hand side, we've got William Holman Hunt. Upon receiving the portraits, Woolner wrote to William Michael saying, "Your brother's drawing of you is a very great boon to me. It looks calmly upon me as your own face wont, and as I contemplate it, my own soul in some unknown way holds communion with yours." So it was obviously it meant a great deal to Woolner, and it was of great sentimental value to have received these portraits while he was out in Australia. The portrait of William Holman Hunt, he's got this kind of very intense, penetrating gaze outward. And it's thought that while he was having his portrait done by Rossetti, was in turn William Holman Hunt was in turn drawing Rossetti's portrait. And so that kind of explains that sort of very serious kind of lack of concentration on William Holman Hunt's face there. So I've just got an image just to show what those works look like in the exhibition. It also kind of gives you a good sense of scale here of how they appear. The next section of the exhibition is dedicated to Elizabeth Siddal and Rossetti's portraits of Elizabeth Siddal. So around the same time as the portraits of William Michael and William Holman Hunt were produced in the early 1850s, Rossetti was forming or had formed by that point a close relationship with the artist and model Elizabeth Siddal, who for the next decade would be his sort of principal model, as well as the sitter for a kind of extraordinary series of portrait drawings by Rossetti. There are about 70 portrait drawings that are in existence today, but it is likely that there were far more than that. And it's certainly very easy to get the impression from contemporary accounts about just sort of how obsessively Rossetti drew Elizabeth Siddal's portrait. As Ford Madox Brown recounts in his diary from October 1854, he says, called on Dante Rossetti, saw Miss Siddal looking thinner and more death-like and more beautiful and more ragged than ever. A real artist, a woman without parallel for many a long year. Gabriel has usual diffuse and inconsequence in his work. Drawing wonderful and lovely Guggans was Rossetti's nickname for Siddal, one after another, each one a fresh charm, each one stamped with immortality and his picture never advancing. In another entry of 1855, Madox Brown goes on to say that Rossetti showed him a drawer full of Guggans, God knows how many, but not bad work, I should say, for the 6 years he had known her. It is like a monomania with him. Many of them are matchless in beauty, however, and one day will be worth large sums. So these works, I think, are some of the most kind of intimate and poignant of Rossetti's portraits, and they really show Rossetti and Siddal's life together. There's a real sense of kind of ordinariness in these images, and at the same time they feel quite extraordinary as modern day viewers, or that for me as a modern day viewer, I think you get this sense of the kind of access to the private life that the couple shared. It is worth stressing, however, that we are obviously getting a very one-sided view here. This is very much Rossetti's perspective, and what we are seeing here is very much what Rossetti saw in Elizabeth Siddal. I think a number of the works, I would characterize her as looking, she's graceful, but there's a fragility there, and that's perhaps or most likely due to that kind of unknown illness that she suffered with throughout adulthood. And many of the works kind of capture her in sort of resting or sitting in these sort of quiet states of contemplation. The three works on the slide here are all works that were in the exhibition at the Holburne, and are kind of representative of the different sort of types of portraits that Rossetti produced of Siddal. So as with the first drawing I showed at the beginning of this talk, the left image here shows Siddal at work. And of course, although she's best known as a model, of course, I'm sure we all know of her artistic practice, and that's become much better studied and much better understood and discussed following kind of recent exhibitions at the National Trust, sort of Beyond Ophelia and Pre-Raphaelite Sisters at the National Portrait Gallery in 2019. So there are a handful of works by Rossetti showing Siddal at an easel. This work on the left is admittedly not the best quality, and it has this sort of quite unfinished quality about it. It probably dates to the mid-1850s, soon after Siddal first began her own artistic practice, which began in around about 1854. And it was probably around the time in which John Ruskin became her patron in 1855. It's worth noting that dating these works, this series, is quite tricky, I think, given the sort of repetitious quality of a number of these works. They kind of have very similar scenes, these sort of everyday scenes. So a number of them are very tricky to date. Rossetti did date some, however, a selection of them, and I think he really only dated ones that I think he deemed kind of higher quality ones, such as this work in the middle here, which is really one of the kind of his most exceptional portraits, I think, of his career. This was done in Hastings in 1854, where the couple had gone to for 5 weeks over the summer, following a bout of kind of ill health that Siddal had. So it was sort of to go to the sea for her to recover. As well as being a portrait, I read this work as being a kind of study of light and shade, and the sort of heavy cross-hatching that contrasts the sunlight from the window and the dark interior. So you've got that kind of lovely variation in shade, particularly across her face, as her sort of left cheek is sort of in daylight from the window, and her right cheek is sort of plunged into shadow there. The pen and ink drawing on the right-hand side is actually my favorite work that was in the exhibition. It's a really intimate work. It shows Siddle, it captures her in a kind of moment of rest. She's got her eyes closed, and she's got her kind of characteristic pose here, which she's often depicted by Rossetti with a kind of raised chin. She sort of looks up, and you'll see that in other examples that that I'm going to talk about in this discussion. The kind of quiet peacefulness of the scene here, I think, really contrasts with the sort of energetic lines, the energetic pen and ink lines that he's used to create the scene here, which I think creates this really, really interesting, really lovely contrast. So I've kind of started this talk by focusing on Rossetti's earlier kind of more conventional portraits, and this was definitely something that he continued to produce portraits throughout the rest of his career, examples of which I'll show you in a bit. But I wanted for now to turn my attention to a work that representing Elizabeth Siddal that demonstrates that kind of complexity that I spoke about at the beginning of the talk, that kind of complexity of Rossetti's relationship with the genre of portraiture and the kind of entanglement of biography and fiction and model and literary or biblical character. This kind of complexity really comes to the fore with this work, Beatrix, which Rossetti started in 1864, which is 2 years following Elizabeth Siddal's death in 1862. So the work depicts a subject from Dante's La Vita Nuova, the text from 1294 that recounts Dante's unrequited love for Beatrice, from their first meeting in childhood to concealing his infections in adulthood, and finally to his grief and his spiritual transformation following Beatrice's death at the age of 25. This painting shows Beatrice in a moment of spiritual transformation beyond her death. The work has this sort of hazy atmospheric quality and this sort of amazing golden hues that come from the sort of cityscape of Florence behind and create a kind of halo effect around her head. The heavenly light reaches the sundial, which is sort of in the middle on the right-hand side there, which points to 9, which is the time of Beatrice's death on the 9th of June, 1290, and also Dante's age when he first met Beatrice. Dante is seen in the background just behind the sundial, and he looks over towards Love in the red outfit on the left-hand side there, who holds a flickering flame, and of course in between them there is this Ponte Vecchio, Florence's Ponte Vecchio in the background. This work was modelled on Elizabeth Siddal, and it shows Beatrice in a kind of trance state with her eyes closed and lips parted as she leans forward with her head and palms facing upwards in that same kind of characteristic pose that we saw in some of the portrait drawings of Elizabeth Siddal a moment ago. So one of the most fascinating aspects of this work is that it was started 2 years following after Siddal's death. And it makes evident the parallels between the two figures represented here, so Beatrice and Elizabeth Siddal. So as well as being a Dantean subject, this work has very much been interpreted as a posthumous portrait of Elizabeth Siddal. And it's thought that Rossetti has kind of combined symbols relating to both women. So you have, for example, the bird in the foreground is a messenger of death, but is also a reference to one of Rossetti's other nicknames for Elizabeth Siddal, the dove. And the bird is delivering a white poppy, which is potentially a reference to Siddal's overdose of laudanum. There is also a kind of ambiguity in the cityscape behind, and as well as being Florence's Ponte Vecchio, there is some people have interpreted this cityscape as also showing Blackfriars Bridge, near where Rossetti and Siddal lived during their marriage. In order to kind of really understand this sort of posthumous portrait, that kind of interpretation, I think it's important to note how significant Dante was as a figure for self-identification for Rossetti. So Rossetti's father was a Dante scholar, and Rossetti's full name was Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti. Of course, in reference to the 13th century writer. But when Rossetti first exhibited the girlhood of Mary Virgin in 1849, he switched the order of his name around to Dante Gabriel Rossetti, obviously placing more emphasis on the kind of association with Dante. We know that as well, and kind of from 1848, Rossetti was translating La Vita Nuova, and he'd also started planning a series of watercolors, which were kind of visual translations of the text. So I've got one of these, an example of this here. This is dated to 1852. It was exhibited in the 1852 exhibition. And it's called Beatrice Meeting Dante at a Marriage Feast, Denies Him Her Salutation. This is the first work for which Rossetti's beloved Siddle modelled for the figure of Dante's beloved Beatrice. And this was a role that Rossetti clearly associated with Siddle, and in which she was cast in several works across the 1850s. So Siddle, you can see here, is in the centre of the composition. You can see her kind of characteristic red hair, and again she's sort of raised her chin there. Returning to Beatrix, the idea of this work originated from the 1850s while Siddle was still alive. As is evident from the drawing on the left-hand side. This is one of 3 life drawings that were used as preparatory studies for the composition representing what was at the time going to be Beatrice falling asleep by a wall bearing a sundial. It kind of shows the kind of the pose that Siddle would then come to be what how Beatrice was shown in the finished oil painting, and it also shows the kind of placement of her hands there. The composition was abandoned while Siddle was still alive, and Rossetti only returned to the work after Siddle's death, suggesting that certainly in some way he connected the kind of Dantean subject with the kind of tragic death of his wife. And this was certainly the interpretation that was given to the work in a retrospective at the Royal Academy in 1883, which was the year after Rossetti died, in which this work was displayed with a caption stating that that Beatrice is a portrait of the painter's wife done after her death. Furthermore, the work remained in Rossetti's studio between 1864 and 1870 until it was bought by one of his patrons, William Cowper Temple. So that it kind of remained in Rossetti's studio for so long, and that 6 replicas were made of this work over a period, has kind of further been suggested as an indication of Rossetti's own personal connection to this work, and that he viewed this very much as a portrait of Siddle as well as of Beatrice. But it is also worth noting that it was common practice for Rossetti to his works to remain in the studio for long periods of time, and for him to produce replicas of his works. So I'm now going to move on to the next section of the exhibition, which was looking at the 1860s and Fanny Cornforth, who would go on to become his principal model in the first half of the 1860s. So Rossetti started working with Cornforth in 1859, and she would go on to become most likely his mistress, and later, after Siddle's death in 1862, she also became his housekeeper and really his companion for which was sort of intermittently his companion for the rest of his life. Between meeting Fanny Cornforth in 1858 and up until about 1874, there are at least 40 portrait drawings of Fanny Cornforth that were done by Rossetti. And like with the portraits of Elizabeth Siddal, these are kind of show their kind of everyday life together. The work on the slide here was done really at the very beginning of their friendship and their relationship in 1859. And I feel like it has this very kind of sculptural quality about it. Rossetti has taken a great deal of care in the kind of cross-hatched background, which was something that was typical of Rossetti's kind of slightly more formal portrait drawings. And this kind of provides depth to the work. And I think, yeah, I feel like her face and her neck have this very kind of quite sculptural quality about them. But I'm not going to focus too much on the portrait drawings in this section. Instead, I want to look at the kind of complete stylistic and technical shift that happened once Cornforth started modeling for Rossetti. And it's this period in around 1859 that Rossetti moved towards a much more kind of sensuous style of painting that was done in oils and indebted to 16th century Venetian old masters. And this would be the kind of style this would be the type of painting that would really become his signature style and what he became known for. These are works that are presented idealized and symbolic celebrations of female beauty. And they kind of very much prioritized visual appeal over narrative. And so it was very much the kind of beginning stages of the aesthetic movement in Britain. And they have quite an ambiguous relationship with the genre of portraiture, but I think that they can be understood as representing both Fanny Cornforth as the model and sitter, as well as kind of Rossetti's idealized visions of womanhood. So like Beatrix, you kind of get this multi-layering of meaning coming through in this work. So the painting that kind of really marked this sort of transition away from the medieval watercolors through to this more kind of Venetian style of painting was Bocca Baciata, Lips That Have Been Kissed, which is a portrait of Fanny Cornforth that was commissioned by their mutual friend, the artist George Price Boyce. So according to Rossetti's brother, William Michael, it was a most faithful portrait. And the patron Boyce wrote on the 13th of October, 1859, that Rossetti had painted a splendid portrait of Fanny for me in late 16th century costume. The kind of eroticized title for the work was taken from the 14th century Italian text Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, which tells of a journey of a princess who, despite having been with 8 different men, she married the King of Algarve while presenting herself as a virgin, which kind of makes clear the sort of sexual connotations of this work. Visually, there is a very clear reference to 16th century Venetian art, not just through Cornforth's costume as her sort of 16th century attire, which is what Boyce noted, but also through the format of a single figure female behind a parapet. And this is a format that very much quotes Titian and Veronese. As well as the sort of the shortened perspective. And I think most significantly here, the use of color, this sort of red, brown, golden hues. So Rossetti has used red as the base color for this canvas. And you can see that kind of space and volume, like with Titian or Veronese, sort of space and volume are built up with kind of color and shading rather than line. So this is very much something that Rossetti took from 16th century Venetian art. So in this case, Rossetti has kind of layered the portrait of Fanny Cornforth with references to these other sort of historical periods. So as well as being an image of a Victorian woman, it is also an image taken from 14th century Italian literature and 16th century Venetian painting. And this is something that we find again and again. This happens throughout Rossetti's work of the 1860s, this kind of merging of different historical points into one image. So another example is this 3/4 length image of Cornforth titled Aurelio Fazio's Mistress, which was painted in 1863. So the title for this work derives from the 14th century poet Fazio delle Uberti's poem dedicated to his mistress's beauty. But Rossetti described the painting as chiefly a piece of colour, referencing the aesthetic movement's motto for art's sake. But it also directly quotes Titian here, through the kind of rich golden Venetian tones, but also the motif of a woman looking before a mirror. And this is a reference to a painting that by Titian that Rossetti saw at the Louvre while he was on his honeymoon in Paris with Elizabeth Siddal. So once again, you kind of have these different historical reference points coming together into one work. You have sort of 14th century Florentine poetry, you have 16th century Venetian painting, and then you have Cornforth, you have Fanny Cornforth, who brings the painting into sort of 19th century Britain. And my interpretation of this is that the subject is really the kind of the timelessness of timeless quality of contemplating beauty. So the final section of the talk is about Jane Morris. And this was also the final section of the exhibition as well. So Jane Morris, obviously, so Rossetti met Jane Morris in 1857 in Oxford while working with William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones on mural decorations for the university's Union building. Rossetti was clearly very taken with Jane Morris and asked her to pose as Queen Guinevere for a work that was never completed, but there is a study for it in Birmingham. At the time, Rossetti was with Elizabeth Siddal, and who wasn't very well, and he left Oxford, and it was, of course, eventually Jane eventually married William Morris in 1859. So throughout the first half of the 1860s, Jane Morris and Rossetti kind of had a very sort of friendly relationship. They met at social gatherings and at Christmases and business meetings for Morris and Co. But it wasn't until 1865 that she really became very central to his life and to his art. And this was the period in which Jane and William Morris moved from Red House to central London, so they were much closer to Rossetti, who was in Chelsea. And it was in this time, so in July of 1865, that Rossetti commissioned from a commercial photographer, John Robert Parsons, commissioned a series of portrait photographs of Jane Morris. So there were 18 altogether of these portrait photographs, and I've got two examples of them here. These are a kind of combination of Rossetti's direction and Morris's sort of self-imaging, I think, and Jane Morris really adopts a series of really quite experimental poses that are very different to what the kind of conventions of Victorian portrait photography, which was really kind of coming into its own in the 1860s. So these poses were used as studies for future compositions, and they kind of emphasize Morris's tall frame and her curved back and her kind of twisted hands. She's kind of got quite, again, this sort of quite sculptural presence here, and I think that's through the kind of the experimenting with light. And to me, I think that these works have a very kind of quite a contemporary feel to them in many ways. I can see in this the sort of legacies of the legacy of these works in kind of contemporary fashion photography now. So a year after the photographs were taken, Rossetti embarked on his most ambitious portrait of his career, the blue silk dress. And this was started in 1866 and was completed in 1868. This was one of the few kind of the formal oil portraits that Rossetti painted. And yeah, it really represents kind of the high point, I think, of Rossetti's relationship with the genre of portraiture. It shows Jane Morris in 3/4 length. She sat at a table, and yet she's sort of turned towards us as if in a moment of contemplation, as she looks up from her book. Her back leans forward slightly, which again is sort of it's kind of at odds with Victorian portraiture at the time, and is a sort of subtler version of the pose that we saw earlier on in these photographs. And I think so, and correspondence between Jane Morris and Rossetti showed that they kind of collaborated on this pose and this kind of how they both wanted Jane Morris to be presented, or how Jane Morris wanted herself to be presented, I should say. So her hands are twisted inward, which is something of quite a characteristic pose of Jane Morris, and it's something that we see in the photographs that were taken of her in 1865. And I think, I mean, here that the hands sort of twisted inward, it really, you know, it's the center of the composition, and what that does in this case is really draw the viewer's eye, draw our eye to her, the kind of her elongated neck and her face, and the kind of amazing mass of hair that Jane Morris became so unknown for. There's the kind of typical embellishment of floral pieces in the background. So you've got the pink carnations. There's a pink carnation in her dress. Jane Morris made the dress. I should add that in. That Jane made the dress for this. And there's the pink carnation that's in that's tucked in there, and also on the book, and that's a symbol of love and marriage, and a reference to Jane's marriage to William. And there's also this sort of beautiful still life of white roses on the table. So it was around the time that this work was produced that Rossetti developed this kind of all-consuming kind of obsession with Jane Morris that remained until his death in 1882. It's not really exactly clear how Jane Morris felt about this, or really what the nature of their relationship was, but in different correspondence, Jane is very clear that they were never lovers in any sense. Although I think that there's been a lot of mythology, and it's often they're described as being lovers very often. I find in books and online. Their companionship, in whatever form it took, was really at its strongest in the summer of 1871, when Jane, Rossetti, and Jane and William's two children spent the summer in Kelmscott Manor in Oxfordshire, while William was travelling to Iceland. Whatever the kind of nature of Rossetti and Jane Morris's relationship was, it was clearly a period of happiness for them. And one of the works that came out from this period was Proserpine. It started off as a chalk drawing. It's now at the Ashmolean in 1871, and he began working on oil versions in 1872. So Proserpine, this is the image of the Roman goddess who was captured and became the unwilling wife of Pluto. So her mother pleading with Jupiter to return her to Earth, which he agreed to do, providing Proserpine had not eaten any fruit of the underworld. She had, however, eaten a single pomegranate seed, and this was an act that then sentenced her to have to spend her winters in Hades with Pluto, and only returning to Earth to her mother in the summer. And this narrative quite neatly ties with Jane Morris's own situation at the time, which is, you know, she's said to be trapped in this kind of unhappy marriage and spending winters in London with William Morris, and then the summer in Kelmscott Manor with Rossetti. So, you know, like with Beatrice and like with those paintings of Fanny Cornforth, this work has become understood as much as a portrait as it is an image of Proserpine. You can see in Proserpine how much Rossetti by this point has moved away from the Titianesque oils of the 1860s that we find with images of Fanny Cornforth. He's moved to a green and blue palette, which is something that a palette that he really used for his images with Jane Morris. It's clearly a palette that he really associated with her. But the format of Rossetti's works has also changed in this period. He's becoming more interested in Botticelli and Michelangelo at this point. And his compositions evolved into kind of taller narrative works that are perhaps inspired by Jane's kind of tall statuesque build. This is a format that pushes the entire kind of figure up. And so the viewer we have to look up to her as if she's, you know, as a figure to be worshipped. This idea of kind of worship and the fact that she's a Roman goddess is further highlighted by the incense burner that we see that resting on the parapet in the foreground. the parapet kind of creating this barrier between us, and kind of highlighting her position as a sort of unattainable goddess. And you kind of teasingly, there is her sleeve kind of cascades over the other edge of our edge of the parapet, and it kind of highlights this idea of her being sort of just out of reach. The poem, which I've put up on the screen here, I won't read this out, but this is the poem that Rossetti wrote to accompany the painting. It's on the frame, Proserpine's frame, and it kind of similarly, it's written from her perspective, and it centers on kind of pain and distance of and kind of longing. So the work on the left-hand side, this was the version that was done in 1874. This is at Tate. And by that point, the kind of relationship between Rossetti and Jane Morris had very much taken its toll. And Rossetti, following a kind of terrible review of Rossetti's poetry, his mental and physical health continued to decline. And Jane kind of ended up sitting for him less and less, although she remained his primary muse up until his death in 1882. And you can see that from this version on the right hand side here, another version of Proserpine that was done just before Rossetti's death. I think it's dated to 1882. And really interestingly, this work, you can see the kind of difference in tone and color here. And by this point, how this has been understood is Rossetti kind of merging at this point the figure of Jane Morris and Elizabeth Siddal. So the kind of red hair, the pale complexion and red hair is thought to be a kind of reference to Elizabeth Siddal by this point. And I think that that's quite interesting. It sort of adds another layer of kind of complexity to understanding these works as portraits. I think they are, Proserpine is a portrait of Jane Morris, but it's not entirely clear cut. And as you see different versions of Proserpine, there's certainly different variations in how Jane Morris is represented, and here she is represented with the sort of merging of Elizabeth Siddal. I forgot to say earlier that I think it's really interesting to note her hands again here. I think there's that kind of characteristic pose of her twisted inward, and she's sort of supporting one hand in the other. This is very kind of characteristic of Jane Morris. So I know we're running out of time, so I just wanted to end very briefly I wanted to kind of end how I started, which is kind of looking at family portraits. So this is a moving double portrait of his sister Christina and his mother Frances that was done in chalk in 1877. And it was done while Rossetti was recovering from an operation and was also suffering from depression. And this was the first work that he had, that he was sort of able to, it sort of marked the beginning of his recovery at this time. It's in chalk, and this is a medium that he kind of moves to with his portraits, particularly sort of from the sort of second half of the 1860s onwards. He works a lot with chalk, and he seems to prefer working in chalk to working in oil towards the end of his life. In this portrait, there's a sort of strong sense of melancholy in the work, but I think it's also a very touching image. And I think because it marks the resumption of his artistic practice, it clearly held a sort of sentimental value for him, and it hung in his sitting room in Chelsea. So I wanted to end with this work because I think it shows that how significant, portraiture remained a significant genre for Rossetti up until the end of his career. But I think it also encapsulates, or it ties in together what I think all of these works are about. I think Rossetti's portraits are really very much about relationships, and are clearly portraiture as a way for Rossetti to commemorate and celebrate, and to understand the bonds that he shared with loved ones. So I will end there. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. That was fabulous. You know, I couldn't make it to Bath to see that exhibition, and so to be able to get taken around it on a curator-led tour for an hour and get just as much from it from you today has been amazing. So thank you so much from me, and I'm sure from everybody listening. Does anybody have any questions for Sylvie? We've got a very practical one that you might be able to help with, which is, will the show be repeated elsewhere?
No, unfortunately not. We had originally thought about whether we could tour the show, and it's a real shame that we haven't been able to. I think partly it was because a lot of the works were works on paper, and so which is very difficult to tour, to be on loan for long periods. So unfortunately, no, it's not on anywhere else. There is a publication that accompanied the exhibition, and just doing a little plug.
No, I was just about to say, I believe it's a very good book, however.
So yes, it's there encapsulated in the book. Yeah,
so can we get that on the Holburne's website?
Yeah, it's on the Holburne website. It's it's on the Holburne website. It's also on Amazon, but yeah, go through the Holburne website.
Absolutely. Whilst people send their lovely thank yous, and if anyone wants to think of a question, I'll jump in with one if I may. You mentioned just then that there were lots of works on paper in the exhibition, and I wondered if, just to play devil's advocate for a second, we can look at Rossetti's portraits completely objectively in terms of the materials he made them from, and whether that tells us anything about him as an artist and what he was trying to do with his portraits, rather than simply reading them as these are sort of portals into biography, which is, you know, it's such an exciting thing to do with Rossetti because he had some quite mad life. But if we sort of look at that difference between his oils, pastels, and the pen drawings, which those very early portraits he made at the start, so of what kind of a sense we get of him as an artist by doing that and sort of stripping that biography away.
I mean, I think the question of medium is a really interesting one. I mean, my feelings about particularly his portrait drawings. He was so prolific as a portraitist in terms of his drawings and his graphite and his pen and ink works. And to me, my feeling about those is these are very, on a very practical level, they're very easy mediums. They're very, they're not cumbersome in any way. It's the kind of thing that could be picked up. They're mediums that could be picked up while he is in a social setting, or, and they're quite quick as well. I think portrait drawings, they can be done in one afternoon, in one sitting. And so I think for those, there is that, I think that really is a sign of kind of that sort of informality. And I think that I mean, my impression actually of Rossetti as a portraitist is that he was almost kind of, it was almost like a compulsion for him to draw the people around him. I almost feel like you'd be sat with him and he would just be drawing away. So I think that's really telling in the fact that the majority of his kind of what I kind of call conventional portraits, although I've always wanted a better phrase than that. The fact that the majority of those are in pencil and pen, and then later on in life in chalk, which he definitely did prefer to oil paintings from the kind of as his eyesight was getting worse in the late 1860s. I think it's that sort of kind of almost a compulsion to draw his sort of his surroundings. I think with oil, it's interesting. I mean, oil was a medium that he kind of struggled with in the 1850s. He did very, very few oil paintings. There's a St. Catherine that's the Tate that was actually in the exhibition as well. But really, I mean, and also very early on, his Pre-Raphaelite paintings were done in oil. But it really isn't until the 1860s that he starts working on this. And I mean, I think the thing with oil paintings is that they take so much more time. They need to be sold. I think they need to make money in a way that his portrait drawings, I think, are much more, his drawings are personal. They're there for him. So there's definitely, I think with his oil paintings, there's a practical aspect to it, which is that he was a commercial artist, and he was also producing works for patrons, which I think also explains a bit some of the replicas of, you know, Proserpine and Beatrix were successful works, successful formulas that they clearly patrons wanted versions of. So yeah, there's certainly a commercial aspect to many of these works.
Brilliant, thank you. So 2 more questions have come in, and I think that's all we'll have time for, so I'll ask these ones to Sylvie now. So in Christina Rossetti's poem In an Artist's Studio, she criticises his paintings for always showing the same woman, not as she is, but as she haunts him. Do you think that's fair, and do you think Rossetti himself was aware of this? And then following on from that, what does that mean for his paintings and his portraiture?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of whether he was aware, I think that's really hard to know. I think it is fair. I think what Christina Rossetti is saying there, I've interpreted as, you know, he's sort of he's kind of conflating in a way actually what he does with Beatrix and Proserpine. He almost conflates the real woman with the visual representation of her, or the kind of the figure that she represents. And so I do think that it's fair that there is a kind of a that poem can be understood. It can do well to interpret Rossetti's works. I mean, I think that poem, to me, it connects most closely to his portrait drawings of Elizabeth Siddal, and it's that kind of that idea of it's kind of quite it's compulsive. He's kind of continually feeding off of her image in a way, and that's really what those portrait drawings are doing. But in terms of his own awareness of it, it's hard to know. I imagine he would. I think he was quite a self-aware artist in many ways.
I think that's fair too.
Yeah, so I think he probably was aware. But yeah, it's tricky to say.
Lovely, thank you very much. And finally, considering that they lived together for months on end over several years, and Rossetti wrote love poems about her, etc., what makes you say that Jane and Rossetti were not lovers? Shouldn't his portraits of her be seen as depictions of these lovers, or one of his lovers?
So I think the main thing that makes me say, well, so I don't necessarily think that, so I'm quite cautious about it. I wouldn't necessarily say one way or another. I guess what I wanted to kind of put forward was that I think that it's quite easy to have an interpretation that is that they had an affair and that they had a romantic relationship outside of her marriage to William Morris, and that is certainly something that is continually repeated in books and in what I read, on museum websites. But I do think it's more complicated than that. And actually, Jane always said that they never had any form of romantic relationship. She was very clear on that in her correspondence. So in her correspondence to Georgiana Burne-Jones, she was very assertive about the fact that they never had any form of relationship. But of course, that is also a correspondence with, perhaps she didn't want anybody to know. I guess the tricky thing is that we just don't know. So I kind of err on the side of caution and want to say it could be either way.
That's it. It's an interpretation of history, isn't it, at the end of the day?
That's it. Yeah.
You can see the appeal of interpreting it as such.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much again, Sylvie. It's been a pleasure to have you this afternoon, and what a fantastic talk. Please do go and buy the catalogue as well if you'd like to know more. I have seen it, and it is a brilliant thing, so please do that. Thanks everybody for listening, and I wish everybody a lovely rest of the day and a lovely weekend. Thanks, Sylvie.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.